Hello all, this is your Professor Ian. This is my lecture on something called the rhetorical situation and a tool called SOAPSTone. So let's get into it. Rhetorical situation is a term that rhetoricians use to describe the context in which a piece of rhetoric or a text that engages in rhetorical language, the context of that piece of writing or that text. In other words, the who, why, what that surrounds the message instead of the message itself, right? So one thing that I've argued is that in order to fully understand the content of a text, the actual message, X is true because of Y or whatever the message is, we need to think about who wrote it, why they wrote it, what they're trying to accomplish, all the context surrounding that piece of rhetoric. And then we can get to the content of the rhetoric itself. So let's just step back a little bit. Rhetoric is often demonized word, but it just means the art of using language effectively and persuasively. So there is, usually when we hear the word rhetoric, it's being used to describe empty language, like, oh, that's just empty rhetoric, or that's just political rhetoric, or that's just whatever kind of rhetoric, and it's used dismissively to describe manipulative and empty language. However, rhetoric is a neutral term. It just means using language effectively and persuasively, which we all do every day, right? Every time you try to win an argument or persuade someone to your point of view, you are engaging in rhetoric. So, and then in our class, we'll be engaging in rhetorical analysis. So we'll be analyzing how speakers and creators of text try to use language to effectively persuade us or influence us. So we can define rhetorical analysis as the examination of text to determine how the author shapes the content to achieve a purpose for a given audience. In other words, finding what the writer wants the reader to understand by analyzing his or her language usage, literary and rhetorical techniques. Right? So again, instead of just thinking about the message, X is true because of Y, or whatever, we're thinking about, okay, they're using a lot of humor to try to persuade me here, or they're using scare tactics to frighten me into accepting their point of view, right? Thinking about these kinds of things, or using a lot of literary language and metaphors to kind of make these connections in their writing, right? So that's what we're doing with rhetorical analysis. We're looking at how the writer is trying to convince us instead of what the author is trying to convince us to think or to believe. So the rhetorical situation, again, we can define as the context, right? So the stuff surrounding the message that explains who is communicating, who the target audience is, and who is not. That's interesting sometimes. The reason for the specific communication and the stylistic choices the communicator makes to achieve their purpose. These are all things that go into the rhetorical situation or that context surrounding rhetoric. Okay, so that's the rhetorical situation, and in order to think about the rhetorical situation, we're going to add a tool to our critical thinking toolbox. This is this image I like to return to, this idea of adding tools to our toolbox that we can pull out when we want to analyze arguments and rhetoric. This one's called SOAPSTone. You might have come across this before. I didn't make this up. This is a very commonly taught and used tool in rhetorical analysis, and it's an acronym. It stands for subject, occasion, audience, purpose, speaker, and tone. Sometimes you see different variations with the T, right? So it just ends with speaker. Just same thing. The reason I like SOAPSTone is because it's like a checklist, right? So whenever you come to a piece of rhetoric, it asks you to, okay, I'm going to stop and I'm going to go through my little checklist and I'm going to think about these different ideas before I get into analyzing the actual message itself, right? So I'm going to stop and I'm going to think about, okay, what is this about? What's the subject? Okay, the occasion. When was this written? Is it responding to something? For whom is this written? For whom is it not written? Why is it written? And that can be, subject and purpose. They're very similar sometimes. But of course, they can be very different. The purpose is the actual thesis or the intent of the author, where the author might cover a number of different subjects, as we're going to see in my example, but their purpose is very singular, potentially. There might be multiple purposes as well. The speaker, like how does the speaker present themselves? What kind of persona are they trying to create in their in their rhetoric? Do they want to come across as, just common folk, like, just a normal person? Or are they trying to come across as very educated? Are they trying to come across as very sarcastic? Like, what kind of persona are they adopting, and why? And, these are very deliberate choices that authors make. And finally, tone. And tone refers to the attitude towards things towards the subject that the author has, and that's created with different kinds of language, different kinds of literary techniques, and that kind of stuff. So that's the end of my first video. We'll get into an example using SOAPSTone in my next. Okay, actually, why don't I just show you that? Here's the example. If you want to go ahead and pull this up on your computer, we'll take a look at this together using SOAPSTone. I just went to the LA op-ed page and pulled the first example. This is it's called Kamala Harris's Immigrant Family Story is an inspiring reminder of why we need to vote out Trump. And here's the address if you want to open that. I'll also paste it below. Okay, thank you very much. I'll see you in video 2.